Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Live Your Dreams podcast. I'm your host, Joe Gawalis, alongside my co-host,
Chris Victor.
Chris. Today we have on a very, very special guest whose artistry brought to life two beautiful films that premiered at the prestigious Toronto International Film Festival. First off, Matt and Mara. Nikolay created a raw visual language using handheld close-up approaches that put you right into the audience's world. And then Measure for a Funeral, where it was dynamic, haunting, the flare with wide-angle lenses. It was a beautiful, beautiful film. Very different, both films. I'll tell you one thing in common was they were both beautiful. Please welcome to the Live Your Dreams podcast, the incredible cinematographer, Nikolay Michaylov, to the Live Your Dreams podcast. Thank you, my friend, for coming on.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to talk with y'all today.
No, really, man, your films were beautiful. First off, before we get into anything, it's always a pleasure to see a cinematographer who's amazing at his craft bring films to life.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, it's a fun job. I feel lucky to even call it a job. You know, it's that yeah, I get to do it every day. I get to watch movies and study movies and then make them, and yeah, it's certainly a privilege to make art for a living.
Oh, 100%. I'm so glad you said that for our aspiring artists and artists that are listening. Now, those that talk about that, making art for a living, and we'll get into the films, Nikolay, but what kind of brought you down that path as a young man, discovering your love for art, your love for cinema? I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey that brought you into this world.
Yeah, I think the easy answer is skateboarding.
Okay, sure.
I've been skateboarding since I was 12. I think for people who are familiar with skateboarding, especially in the early 2000s when I started doing it, recording or capturing your skateboarding clips kind of goes hand in hand with the culture. So I didn't own any cameras growing up, but a few of my friends did. And yeah, I think just like people do today with their iPhones, we would go out to the curbs and just kind of document our progress. And then eventually you kind of obsess over them and you look at them, and then you want to edit a little movie out of it because you watch skate videos, you get inspired by those cultural moments. When you see an amazing skate video, you want to replicate your favorite pro skater. It kind of built from there. And then when I went into high school, I was like full-fledged skater, just wanted to go pro, like everyone, wanted to get sponsored. And then yeah, the filmmaking and the technology kind of evolved. But I was lucky to go to a high school that had a dark room, and it wasn't an arts high school, but there was a lot of emphasis on the arts. There was a music program, there was a film class, there was a photo class, there was a media class, and I kind of took all of those things. And a lot of my time in high school was spent skipping class, but recording my skateboarding with my friends, and spending extracurricular time, funny enough, in the darkroom. So shooting photos, developing the film, and then printing the film, mostly black and white, or I should say all black and white. But what's funny though is I wasn't the best student until like towards the end of high school, because my parents put a lot of pressure on me. The like classic immigrant parents, they just really focus on your studies. So I was actually quite good at math and computer science, and half my course load by the 12th grade was all these arts courses, but the other half were these maths and sciences. And interesting. Yeah, a lot of the adults in my life were like, there's no money in the arts. You kind of have to focus on these like harder skills that can have a certain career. And so I enrolled to a local university here called TMU, or Toronto Metropolitan University, and I got a full scholarship into the IT management program. And that's actually what I went to school for 2 years, and I hated it. And I was just kind of doing what I was doing in high school. I was like skipping class, I was skateboarding, I was still continuing to make skate films with my friends, and I was watching a lot of movies. And funny enough, in the titular IT management class, there was this survey that the professor had given to everyone in the first week of class to kind of identify your skill sets and your interests.
Sure.
It takes it's kind of like a personality test, like that I think management at big companies give their employers to kind of uh work on their like hard skill sets and
Sure,
like
sure. Yeah, yeah. Like Myers-Briggs or something, one of those kind
yeah,
of
kind
assessment
of.
tests. Yes, yeah.
And they cost a lot of money. Like businesses will invest a lot of money and give them to their employees. Anyways, this guy, he gave it to the class and I filled it out and it kind of tells you like what career paths you should pursue.
Mm.
And ironically, it was like filmmaking for me.
Wow.
Mm.
I
That's
kind of
wild.
yeah, it was like filmmaking and I was watching a lot of nature documentaries at the time. And the second one was like a career in zoology. So I was like, okay, yeah, I like documentary filmmaking, like natural history filmmaking would be an amazing prospect for me. I'd love to do that.
Sure.
But my perspective on filmmaking was so naive. And so what I did was I took that as a sign and I dropped out of out of this full
Sure.
scholarship
There you go. Yeah.
and yeah, I hit up the film department and I was like, I want to transfer. And they're like, hold on, cowboy, like you can't just transfer into the program. You have to apply. There's like it's a very competitive program. Like people apply every year, they don't get in. So like work on your portfolio and then apply. And so because I already dropped out, I started working with my dad, who's an HVAC technician. I
Sure.
continued to kind of work in the IT sector while working on my portfolio. And I took some continuing ed courses in film at the university, like night school and weekends. And I kind of got some of the first year coursework out of the way and I ended up applying and getting into the film program there and went right into second year. Um, but by that point, again, I had this naive perspective on filmmaking where I thought you wrote and directed and produced and shot and edited everything yourself. And so that's kind of what I did when I was in my first year. We were shooting on Bolexes on 16 millimeter black and white, and
Sure. Yeah.
we would develop the film, and then we would take our working print and like cut and tape on a moviola and manually edit our films. And so yeah, by the time I was in second year, um, I guess people saw that I had these like pretty good technical capabilities with a camera and everyone just started asking me to shoot their movies and I kind of like fell into it like fumbling
Huh.
through. I didn't know how to light anything. I knew how to work a camera, but yeah, just the craft of cinematography was never something I considered until people kind of asked me to and then I took it seriously. And then by fourth year I was exclusively shooting and yeah, kind of built from there.
That's a beautiful journey, and I
Yeah.
love what you did, and you took that kind of leap of faith, and you bet on yourself to get involved with it. But I still love that you're telling our listeners it was a naive approach at the same time. Like you didn't know exactly how the industry worked. That takes a lot of guts, really, to do something like that. That this is a lot about your integrity and who you are.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's you always hear that like kind of cliche, like if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And I think we kind of started the show almost on that tone. Like it's true. I do think it is such a scary prospect, and it certainly takes uh, a certain type of contextual situation for that to happen. I was lucky. Like I lived at home. I had, a roof over my head. Not everyone has that privilege. Like
Sure.
people have to sustain themselves somehow. And I think that was something that in retrospect, look back at film school. Like I think people in film school have a hard time because there's no real rules to
Mm.
filmmaking. But when you're in the 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 arena of institutionalized education, specifically related to the arts, there are certain ways that things are done. And I think it was easy for me because I was like straight white guy that was able to be like, well, fuck the rules. I can just do whatever I want and
There
kind
you
of
go. Yeah.
but um I do think there is like a level of taking a leap of faith and just trusting your instinct and your artistic approach that will benefit everyone. I think it's just good advice to tell anyone. Yeah.
That's fantastic, and thank you for sharing that advice. Now, for the listeners that do want to get involved with cinematography, like you said, when you started really touching the camera more, you started getting around it. You brought up a very big point. You didn't know much about lighting. You knew about the technical aspects of camera work. What kind of got you involved with now learning like the intricacies of cinematography? Because for those of our listeners that don't know, a cinematographer is not a cameraman. That's not what that is. There's a big difference between an operator and what a cinematographer does. What really, when did you start to see and look at films differently and start to really develop your skills as a cinematographer and see that as something completely different than just being more of a technical operator?
I think it was like the first project in second year where another DP who I think knew, going into it knew he wanted to be a DP. This
Sure,
guy,
sure.
his name was Eves, really talented cinematographer, but he wanted to direct a film. And he was, we had worked together on this other thing as operators. And he was just like, hey, you know how to use a camera, shoot my movie. And then we would like go to these spaces and he would be like, so how are you going to light it? And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not, I knew how to get an exposure, but I never thought
Sure.
about creatively using light. And so, you know, a lot of, I attribute a lot of my learning from working with other cinematographers that maybe had directorial instincts or interests and just riffing off of them. Like I couldn't have done it alone. And then yeah, throughout film school, I think there was this like kind of social pressure. It's like, oh yeah, a DP is not just an operator. It's someone who brings a creative process through camera movement and framing, but also through the light. And I kind of just obsessed with it. And maybe to like a neurotic degree where like in third and fourth year, I kind of maybe overcompensated a bit and
Hmm.
light plans would be like super over the top or technical. And then I'd kind of light myself into a corner and it would just be ridiculous. But at the same time, I think that's the perfect arena to kind of make those kinds of mistakes or decisions. Like
Yep.
something I tell young filmmakers all the time is like, school is the best place to kind of mess up and like fail. It's the
Yep.
safest place to do that because everyone is kind of doing. No one really knows what they're doing, and when you get to the real world, you know, there are like financial, economic, reputational consequences
Mm.
to the artistic decisions that you make. And of course, you can still fail in the real world too. Not that school is not the real world, but yeah, I think school is the best place to do that because everyone around you is doing the same thing. Yeah,
I got to give you a big thank you, though, to you and all the cinematographers out there, because a lot of times over the years, it was with your attention to detail, that neurotic, that's that state that you go into, it makes the difference. If a film, let's say there was a writing or the acting wasn't as strong, you guys have saved the day for me because I've seen a lot of films with some beautiful cinematography. Where it's like, okay, this is still a good film. It needs a little tweaking, but you guys really, really, a picture is 1,000 words, and basically that's what you guys are doing.
for sure. You know, but on that note, like a good cinematography can't make a film good. And like I think my interest as a cinematographer has always been like the the unified effort to
Mm.
make sure that the picture is good across the board. Like I'm a huge believer in like you're only as strong as your weakest link. And I think you kind of have to like it's a collaborative effort. So if the
Mhm.
acting's not good and I'm working on a project that I'm shooting, like you know, I'll defer to my crew a bit more and I'll really work with the director and not try to hijack the situation, but maybe offer space that allows room for improvement so that the performances can come through. And yeah, that might sometimes mean like a less intricate or elaborate setup or camera movement or whatever, but if it's going to make the film better in the long run, I'd much rather the film be good than my images stick out. You know what I mean? If they can happen simultaneously, that's the dream.
Yes.
I love your thought of collaboration and making it an entire process like that. Again, it shows why your films are so beautifully shot. And that kind of brings us into our next point. Now, you went through the film school process. It's amazing that you took that journey and where you kind of went from there. Now, how was it the first time? Because a lot of people that are pursuing this career path, a lot of people that get involved with the arts and film school, it's kind of where you start to see people fall off, right? They kind of start walking into the business, they get discouraged very quickly, and they kind of disappear and they're gone, right? Dreams extinguish, they go and they get a regular job. How was your transition now going from film school to now starting to break into the craft?
It's a good question. You know, I have to say there was a little bit of luck involved in my situation. So in second year, a professor of mine who I guess kind of identified my skills, put me in touch with Kaz Radwanski, who directed Matt and Mara.
That's great.
One of the films that you introduced at the beginning of the show. And Kaz had just finished his first feature, which was called Tower. And the cinematographer on that film was no longer pursuing a career in filmmaking. And so Kaz was looking for someone to replace him. So James, my professor, connected me with Kaz. I went out for coffee with him and his producing partner, Dan Montgomery, at MDFF. And we kind of clicked. We kind of just talked about movies, the movies that we were interested in. I showed them some of my work. And then they were at the time commissioned to create these medical videos for like universities, kind of like training models based off of like one of the shorts they made a few years ago and or like prior to that moment. And we kind of used it as like a trial run to see if I would be like a good collaborator with them. And so we made one or two of these videos, and yeah, we clicked. And by the time I was in fourth year, Kaz had asked me to shoot a short film called Cutaway. And yeah, so on top of all my curricular work, I was shooting with Kaz already.
That's great.
And, you know, making a bit of money on the side, working with him and doing other contract stuff. So then by the time I finished film school, I had this connection already. So Kaz Tower was kind of revered critically. There was a lot of attention on him at the time. And so people were like, oh, you know, Nikolay, you know, you have a strong collaborator right out of film school. However, if you know Kaz's work, they're not really they don't have a lot of resources. The budgets are always quite small. So what I did while I was in film school, and this is maybe a bit of a tangent, but advice that I give to students all the time is work on films of the peers that you go to school with, whether they're in your year or the years above you, because that's where I learned a lot of my skills. And when those people graduated, they hired me as a technician. So I was gaffing and camera assisting on their films right out of film school. And I kind of had to like find the balance between being a technician and shooting my own work. And it was funny, like one of my friends, Jackson, he was shooting a feature called The Lockpicker. It was his first feature. He's an amazing cinematographer. And I was the gaffer on that film.
Sure, yeah.
So Monday to Friday, 7 to 7, I was gaffing this film. And Kaz and Dan, they also had full-time jobs. Kaz was working construction. Dan was working at a documentary production company. But Kaz wanted to make his second feature called How Heavy This Hammer. And the only time we could find the time to shoot it was on evenings and weekends. So while I was gaffing this feature, I was sometimes leaving that set and then going and filming like one scene for How Heavy This Hammer, like for a few hours, and then I'd go home and go to bed. And then on the weekend, we'd shoot longer days. So it was like a bit of a grind, but like slowly the scale started, you know, shifting towards just shooting the things that I wanted to shoot. And I kind of ran away from the technician world where I think I could have continued, and like the projects were getting bigger and the package trucks were getting more substantial and the technical skills that I was getting were getting quite advanced. But yeah, I actually started to pretend like I didn't know how to use that equipment because I didn't want people to be a technician anymore. I wanted to really focus on cinematography.
I love that you said that, because I love that you again took that leap of faith. Your whole psyche, who you are as a person, I like that you're always doing that. You're betting on yourself. You're moving forward. Because one of the questions I was going to ask, and I saw this happen to a lot of friends of mine, they break in with a particular idea, and like you said, you're not going to become a cinematographer or a director or one of those higher tier positions overnight. You have to start grinding as a technician in the business. You're going down a certain path, and it's very easy to kind of get those golden handcuffs and say, you know what? Yeah. No, I may just be a gaffer. That's okay. I'm starting to get paid a lot. I'm starting to do very well in that direction, and, you know, give up on kind of the first step you wanted to be into the business in the first place. What kind of advice, or you kind of said it, but like in your mindset, when did you really think, or when you're talking to somebody who's trying to break in, is there a time frame when you would say it's time for somebody to step away from the overall grind of just doing it, obviously outside of survival, but is there a certain time when you have to say, I have to go for what I want and I have to step away from taking the easy path and just kind of, you know, kind of walk away from those golden handcuffs?
No, I mean, you kind of touched on it. Like, I think the number one thing is survival, like being able to sustain
Yeah,
yourself. Everyone comes from a different background and allows them to do or not do those things. But I actually saw a clip. I think it's from the Deakins podcast, and I'm glad it came from Roger Deakins. I don't think
yeah.
in the art world there should be a metric for that at all. I think when the
Mhm.
time is right, do it. You're never too old to be an artist. You're not,
Mhm.
there are some filmmakers that didn't make their first film until they were like in their 40s or
Yeah,
50s or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah.
Like you look at an Orson Welles story when he made Citizen Kane in his early 20s, like that's amazing.
That-
That's super cool. But I don't think we should be imposing this like athlete metric that,
mm,
you see in sports all the time where it's like if you haven't done anything by the end of your 20s, like you're washed, you're done for.
Yeah,
Yeah. Like I think if anything, like I love getting older, I love getting wiser. Those life experiences like shape who I am as a person and then in turn shape the way I look at the world and want to photograph it. And so, yeah, I don't think that type of pressure is helpful in any way whatsoever. I
I
think,
love that. That was a great answer for our listeners out there, and it
yeah,
kind of
really good.
perfect transition again. Let's talk about now. You're getting to what's going on. You mentioned Matt and Mara a little bit earlier, right? And you talked about the way you see the world through your lens, because I felt that was such a personal movie. I felt like you're there with them. The way you shot that was beautifully done. It feels like you're in the world with them, is flowing with them. It has that great flow, and it has a bit of maturity. You're seeing the relationship. You're seeing the people. I loved your vision in that film. I'd love to hear about your journey in Matt and Mara and how you saw that kind of start to your career transform as you got involved with that.
Yeah. Uh, with a Kaz film, it's interesting because a lot of that perspective actually comes from his instincts. The first time I shot with him on like one of those medical videos that I was mentioning, that I would be shooting and just instinctually responding to the improvisational nature of the performances that he lays out before
Sure.
me. But his number one note is always, can you go closer? Can you zoom in closer? Like he really just wants to be like in your
Right in
face.
there. Yeah, yep, yep.
And so, like, if you look at Tower and how heavy this hammer, and even and at 13,000 feet, like that is the consistent visual tone of the films, like this like probing claustrophobic frame. But with Matt and Mara, we were coming off of the heels of Anne at 13,000 feet, where like I think of all the films that I've worked with, Kaz probably had the most evocative camera language with respect to like Anne's mental state throughout the
Mm,
film, how chaotic the camera was. And, a lot of that visual language in Anne at 13,000 feet was messy. It's like super shaky. It's out of focus half the time because I didn't have a focus puller. And we were on a like super long focal length. Kaz, I think when he saw the relationship between Matt Johnson and Derek Campbell, like the romantic relationship that they had in that movie, he wanted to build on that with Matt and Mara with totally different characters. But he knew now this film is about two people. We need to go a bit wider. We need to be a
mm.
bit more stable. And so by virtue of just like these like very pragmatic or practical considerations for the film, it allowed me to maybe see and do a bit more.
Sure,
Uh,
sure.
so I still knew that I had to embody his instinct with the camera, which is like be intimate, be close. But now we had like stabilization tools. I had a focus puller. Um, but yeah, I also wanted to build off of what we did on Anne and Hammer and do things a little differently. And so there was a bit more maybe structure like on set in terms of like me and the actors kind of negotiating the space a bit
Mm,
more. Whereas before I would kind of just like let them do whatever they want and then we'd kind of figure it out. In this film, Kaz had a beat sheet kind of script and we knew what we were doing and the actors kind of knew what we were doing. And then we'd kind of wing it and then I'd see what they were doing and then I'd light it and kind of orchestrate a movement with the actors without trying to inhibit their instincts too much. And so, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, I'm saying nice. I was just agreeing.
Oh, yeah, yeah. But yeah, I think the evolution from like Anne to Matt and Mara, maybe felt like, I think the maturity was just in like a confidence of what we were doing, you know, like I think whereas before it was like a lot of discovery, you know, in Hammer and in Anne, with Matt and Mara, it was the perfect balance of just like lighting and finding cinematic spaces and you know, working the blocking and the spaces in a way that lent itself to a cinematic capture, but also not completely abandoning Kaz's instinct from, you know, the beginning of his career, which is like truly discovering moments and building off of them, and yeah, building a world of story around these moments until you have like a cohesive film.
Nice.
Yeah, really fantastic, and I love the relationship you seem to have with Kaz. You guys really have a good working relationship. You can feel it on the screen, the way the characters are. It feels like you're really there. I love that. Now you're also working on, you know, A Measure for a Funeral, which is really another beautiful film, but stylistically very different than you know, Matt and Mara. How did you now get involved with that? And again, did you have a relationship with that director, or how was the difference between working with the director you may have not had that relationship with if you did not?
Yeah, kind of a two-parter. So I'll get into how I started to work with Sophia.
Yeah, please.
I mean, the Toronto film community is so rich with amazing different filmmakers, and I knew Sophia a few years before that, but she had done all of her movies herself, kind of in the way that I was saying
Sure.
when I was in school. Like she would shoot, direct, edit, produce all of her own work, sometimes on camcorder, sometimes on 16 millimeter. Um, and I've always been a fan of her work and her collaboration with Dara, who's also it's the same lead in both films.
Right. Yes.
But yeah, I think the reason why Sophia made those films in the way that they were was again just due to resources. She had these personal stories related to, you know, her family history and the archive and music, and with Measures for a Funeral, suddenly she, you know, she was working with a production company that allowed her to expand her universe a bit more. And I would actually credit Dara to kind of nudging Sophia to ask me to shoot the movie, because Dara and I have worked on so many movies together. She's one of my most frequent collaborators, and you know, Sophia and I, we had a pre-existing friendship, and I know she was deliberating between a few different cinematographers, but ultimately, I think she saw some of my work with other friends of mine, like Antoine Bourges and Lina Rodriguez. And I think what she liked about my approach to cinematography was that I was adaptable. Like I didn't impose a style. My ethos to cinematography is like I like to service the director and work with the director and try to extrapolate the vision from their head instead of me coming in with like hard stylistic ideas. Because at the end of the day, that's my interest in filmmaking, is just I always want to experiment and do something different. So yeah, that being said, when we started boiling down to what the visual style of Measures for a Funeral would be, we started with Sophia's films, and then we built off of that. Again, it was one of those things where I didn't want to betray her instincts. She is a filmmaker with such interesting formal ideas, and her films can be quite weird, and I mean that in like the most respectful way. She doesn't make films like anyone that I've ever met before, but she did task me with trying to capture the film with this kind of ghostly elegance, with incorporating Steadicam movement and like a lighting style that was maybe a bit more a lighting style that leaned a bit more into uh yeah, something a bit more tense, something that evoked uh tension or thriller or ghost stories. And yeah, we looked at references that kind of pointed us into those directions, and we just kind of did it. You know, it was a lot of negotiating, like what is appropriate, like how far can we push darkness or pockets of light or like style onto the film. I don't think the film is like overtly stylish, but I think in the grand scheme of her oeuvre and like maybe even like the Canadian indie world, yeah, it is a bit of a removal, or like uh, a bit of I don't, I'm losing the word now, but uh, yeah, an evolution of like what a naturalized art film can look like when you just, yeah,
No,
push the film.
yeah, you're 100% right about that. Really, that's a great way of putting it. Actually, just that description was it exactly said the visuals of the film 100%.
Yeah.
Because it's really was fantastic. Now again, you talked about the Canadian independent film scene. You're in Toronto. You're making that happen with a lot of great artists. Now, both of these films premiere at TIFF, and TIFF is a top tier festival around the world. You just happen to be in Toronto, right? So, but again, to be a part of this prestigious festival with two movies, that is a huge deal. I mean, that's not an easy undertaking. How did that feel again for yourself as a cinematographer in this craft field to say, you know what, these are two great films and they're premiering at TIFF?
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, like you said, there is an international appeal, but having lived in Toronto since I was 3 years old and getting to exhibit the film to all my friends and family, I mean, that's super special. It's
Yeah.
like there's no better feeling than to have an audience that unconditionally supports you. But it's cool, like because it's an international film festival, there are going to be people who are curious about it that have no
Yeah.
connection to the city or the country. And so I'm always excited by what people outside of my circle think about the film as well. Art films occupy a certain space in the world and to certain viewers, and they're films that certainly excite me. But yeah, I'm always excited when people you don't expect respond well to the film. It's a super special feeling.
I'm sure it is, and it's a very, very well deserved feeling. Really, I mean, everything was so enjoyable, and again, your vision on the creative process is something incredible. Believe it or not, we're actually just came to the 35-minute mark already. But before we have to start wrapping up, we have to say first off, I'd love for our audience to learn kind of what's next for you. Do you have any projects in the horizon? Anything you're working on, collaborating on? I'd love to hear more about what you're doing next.
Yeah, I just wrapped a feature this past spring with a director named Kunsang Kiryong here in Toronto. She's a Tibetan filmmaker from Vancouver, but was living in Toronto. And we made a film called 100 Sunset that takes place in the Parkdale community in Toronto. Parkdale houses the biggest diaspora of Tibetans in the world
Oh
outside of
wow.
India. Yeah, and so the film it's a fictional film, but that incorporates the real life community that Casey, Kunsang goes by Casey, but yeah, Casey has a strong connection to her community here in Toronto, and they were participants in the film, and we were shooting in their spaces. And I won't say too much about it, but it's like it's basically about a recent immigrant young woman who is kind of navigating a new space and develops a friendship with another new immigrant, also from the Tibetan community, as they conspire to steal money from like a collective loaning system that
Huh.
Tibetans participate in. Yeah, it's a really cool concept. And yeah, we're in the post-production phase right now, color correcting it. So I'm super excited for that release, probably in 2025. And then in the new year, there's a couple of projects that I'm attached to, but the one with the most concrete legs is a film called Split Rock, directed by Ryan Glover. It's a horror film that takes place in the desert about these geologists who find like a possessed rock
Huh.
in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, I won't say much else, but that'll be shot on 16 millimeter, 2 times anamorphic. So I'm super
Oh,
excited.
that's gonna be all. Are you kidding me? That's cool. Good for you. That's gonna be an
awesome.
awesome experience.
Yeah.
I love your diversity in film styles that you're working on. It's fantastic. It's so much like you're really a student of the craft. I think that's fantastic. I really think it's great. Now, for our listeners, if they want to learn more about you, do you have any social medias, websites, or say somebody is in the Toronto area and they wanted to hire you, somewhere they can reach out to you, or do you go internationally to shoot in the United States or anywhere else? Would you be interested in meeting somebody? How can people learn more or contact you?
Yeah, we can go to my website. It's www.nikolaymihylov.com. Maybe you can spell it out in the.
We'll put links in the description below. Don't worry about that.
So my contact details are there, and a bunch of my work can be found there. And then my social media, which is at Nikolay Michaylov. So pretty simple. If you just search those two things, you'll find me, my work, my contact info, and I do respond to DMs. I do respond to emails. So
Right.
yeah.
No, that's great. And really, Nikolay, not only thank you so much for taking the time and the work you obviously dedicated to your craft, but the way you explain things is so
Yes.
clear. We have so many young listeners that are aspiring filmmakers that listen to the show. You gave real good insight and knowledge, and thank you so much for sharing that with our listeners, because that is so valuable, and that's really what we're trying to showcase. So really, thank you so much for what you shared today.
Hell yeah. No, it's been a real pleasure talking to you both. And yeah, I'm super excited for the future and for people to respond even to this video.
No, absolutely. And
Yes.
Nikolay, we're gonna have descriptions to your website, what you're working on below. Again, we got to have you on again. If you have the next films come on, let us know. We'd love to have you back on the show.
That's right.
Fantastic conversation. As always, everybody, I'm Joe Gawalis.
Chris Victor.
Again, you can always see the Live Your Dreams podcast on our YouTube component, but you can listen to us on the road, on airplanes, around the world on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, Amazon Music, along with every other major podcast platform. Please listen. These are the kind of people you want to support. Nikolay's journey into the business has been nothing less but phenomenal. He's motivational. It's a real inspiration to talk to you, Nikolay. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll have those descriptions in the link below. And everybody, we are the dreamers, and the dreams make the world around. Please support Nikolay and the films he's working on. Thank you so much again for coming on.